Welcome, children of the internet. My name is Noah, and this is 10 Cent Opinions. On this week's episode, we decided to discuss horror and talk about how we can use it to tell better stories. So that includes what goes into a good horror atmosphere, how to use psychological horror, or stories that use psychological horror, and we also touch on why people like horror a little bit. You see, the thing about horror is it forces people into uncomfortable situations, and when you can use that to talk about uncomfortable topics by forcing people upon them using the scenario, you can get some really good stories. Additionally, something you've probably noticed is we actually have 4 people on this episode. We just wanted to see if we wanted to mess around with the formula a little bit and see if having more people would actually get in the way of our discussion or if it would help it. Yeah, you can be the judge of that in the end. But that's all for me. Trying to keep it short and sweet here. So without further ado, here is 10 Cent Opinions. Enjoy. Welcome to the 5th episode of 10 Cent Opinions, ladies and gentlemen. On this week's episode, we're talking about horror. I'm your self-appointed host, Noah, and today we've got...
Hola, this is Colton.
I'm Xander.
And our special guest, in air quotes.
Hi, YouTube.
Yeah, there you go.
This is Michael here.
Alright, so Michael...
You sound like an airline pilot. This is your captain speaking.
So, we're talking about horror this week. If I didn't already say that, then this part's going to get edited out. But...
Well, the first thing that I think of when I think horror is I think the time that I was over at your house, Noah, and we were going to watch The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, it's a good movie.
There was you know how they have the commercials before the movies?
Yeah.
Well, there was one for this movie called Dark Water, and it was literally a room filling with water. And I remember that you couldn't bear to watch as the water climbed up the walls.
It was actually dripping down from the walls.
Made the room wet.
I wonder what happened to that movie. But it was a flop or something.
Should we watch it? Should we watch it? I think that'd be great.
But it added on to the...
Noah has to overcome his fear of water.
It's called Dark Water.
Now you just make being racist, no?
I'm not being racist. That's what it was called. Alright, so putting me aside, we've got, once again, a varying degree of understanding when it comes to, or experience with horror. Like, Michael, I know you love it a lot.
Yeah, as far as the film, movies and TV show wise, I haven't played a lot of horror games though.
Yeah, and then Xander, you've got a decent mixture of both film and games, right?
I guess you could say so.
And then I barely play any horror games, and I haven't watched any horror movies. Dark Water scared me too much. What about you, Colton?
I've played 1 or 2 horror games, and then I typically enjoy horror movies, but I like... There's an important distinction we'll kind of get into later. I like horror movies whenever there's actually an element of story to them. I don't like the sort of movies that come out at Halloween and they're intended to just scare you. So
it's understandable. So, has anybody actually read some of the true psychological horror, like H.P. Lovecraft?
No, I have not.
Xander?
You need Rowan for that.
Rowan read it? Alright, let's get him on the podcast.
Welcome up to our second special guest.
No, there's only one special guest. Even if we bring in new people, they won't be special, they'll just be guests.
There's only one special guest.
It's true.
It's like Highlander.
So, Xander or Michael, why do you guys like horror? We'll start with that.
Because it puts you into a situation that you wouldn't normally be in. It puts you into a state of mind that you wouldn't normally experience. It helps you grow mentally. and I guess in bravery a little bit.
So
yeah, I feel like a lot of it can be attributed to just this addiction to feel something that you normally wouldn't feel because it gives you a rush.
you're
I
saying
think,
you like it because almost like a roller coaster where it's this little intensity that you get.
yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons. There's other ones. That's one of the ones that I know I have, and a lot of people have. But then there are other times where it doesn't have to be hot. Like it doesn't have to be intense. It can be more of a sick kind of slow feeling that you get.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about why people like this because normally it wouldn't be something like a positive thing. Many would say it would be a negative thing. This feeling you get of like this disturbing, unsettling feeling. But I think there is some sort of addiction to this feeling, whether or not it is good or bad.
Do you think media and just, I guess, storytelling in general tends to have an addictive nature in some sort?
It depends.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question. But I think like some of the like whenever people get really passionate about like one specific universe or story, I think that's because they've become addicted to that concept or that set of characters or that setting or whatever.
Obsessed would probably be a better word, or a better word in
Yeah,
that
I think
scenario.
so.
But that is interesting by defining horror by almost more of an addictive nature.
Well, I mean, I think that's what it is. People who like horror, those are the kind of people who like get super hyped up to go watch it. When the people who haven't really seen anything before don't really have the need, they actually like kind of steer away from it. Um,
What do you think? How big do you think the horror fandom, I guess, is?
It really depends on which kind of audience you're looking at, because you have the occasional really big movie that everybody goes and sees, like it. That was probably one of the most recent horror movies that was really popular and also pretty good. And then you have the people who really love like the cult horror movies, like the smaller movies that have this big impact on people that you don't just forget afterwards. And then there are some people who are just really into slashers.
Right, right.
I fall somewhere in the middle of all of those.
See, there's something that fascinates me about horror, and it's not like slasher flicks or just jump scares, but what I've always liked, what I've always appreciated, I've never really experienced anything, but what I've always appreciated is like true horror, which affects you mentally and like sticks with you after you walk away. Not because the monster was particularly scary or there were a lot of jump scares, but because the way the movie or story was structured, it was such a way to create a psychological horror, which scares you because it starts bringing up. It somehow is able to talk about stuff that you have maybe hid away.
Right. That's so one thing I've noticed over the years as I've watched more and more horror movies and learned from the different types is that you can tell. One of the things that I've seen is that you can tell from the trailer if a horror movie is really a good one is how many jump scares it includes, because jump scares are pretty basic and they're not hard to do, right? Because all they do is put a loud noise and you put a scary image up the screen. That's all it does, and it gets the audience's heart rate up. So it's scary, but it's cheap and it's just not creative. So if you see a ton of that in trailers, most likely it's not as well. This is kind of personal, but it's most likely not going to be as good like you said, no, it's got to be uh somewhat it has to have some sort of a psychological aspect to it for it to stand out.
The Five Nights at Freddy's has a psychological aspect.
You want to defend that statement? Explain to me, Xander, how that has a psychological effect.
Well, it has bears and animatronics, and it's scary. And
the backstory was actually pretty scary.
Yeah, like that's the thing is that like just the games themselves aren't very scary beyond just the fact that there's jump scares every now and then, but like the actual story itself gets really creepy at times.
So, one game that I heard about a lot when I was researching this episode would be Silent Hill 2, which takes that psychological approach to horror and applies it. You see, first of all, it uses the uncanny.
In what sense? How does it apply?
Well, beyond using the uncanny very well, which we'll probably talk about in a minute, everything in that world is a representation of a repressed emotion of the main character, but everything is just slightly off. So it puts you in this mindset of everything's slightly wrong, but you just can't put your finger on it, which is the uncanny valley. So,
yeah.
But I haven't played it, unfortunately. I've just done this research, but it seems like by not telling the player directly what everything means and having it be almost a reflection of a very ordinary person, it's able to reflect the viewer and the audience's own emotions. It's like almost like a surrogate for them to project what else they've hidden.
You know, I feel like that's extremely rare in AAA games. I think that's one thing that makes that game so special. One series that you find that a lot that has things like that a lot in it, or not one series, but one kind of game that you see has a lot of psychological aspect is actually I have a soft spot for these games, the old RPG Maker horror games, like The Witch's House and Ib. And, they have, because you can't do much with RPG Maker, just stock, right? I mean, of course, these people probably made all their own textures and models, but, you really have to bank on, psychological aspects and a bunch of ideas and, kind of get this idea into the user's head that the engine can do something that it can't,
kind of like Doki Doki Literature Club.
Almost. Exactly. The indie game industry has a lot of that too.
Yeah. So, I don't have a lot of experience, obviously, with the horror genre, but can you guys pull up any examples of that true psychological horror I was talking about a moment ago?
I think The Witch's House does a good job with atmosphere. It has a very atmospheric area, and it has a very dark and underlying story. I think it does that very well. As far as psychological games go, I would say Amnesia, but Amnesia is kind of in between psychological and jump scare. In that, a lot of the times it's psychological and it's what's in your head, but you also have these giant monsters that are chasing you around, just like in Outlast. But they do it very well. It's not like in Outlast 2 where every other time there's somebody chasing you.
So, why don't we talk about atmosphere for a moment? Because atmosphere seems to be a core part of any horror story. So, anybody, what do you think goes into a good atmosphere in a horror story?
Well, I think, there are different genres of horror. There are slasher films, which are like Scream and Psycho. I think, right, Xander, are those slashers?
Heck yeah.
Those are, so those would be I would say those include very violent scenes. They rely a lot on violence and gore. And really any horror has some psychological aspect like that. Can obviously be like the whole PTSD psychological from an experience that is realistic. And that's the thing about slasher films is that slasher films are very realistic because they're usually something that can happen. Like the Scream is just a home invader who has a knife and is a psycho. That's not exactly real. I mean, I guess it is real, but it's definitely possible, you know.
I think going into that too, um, a good job of being actually sort of captivating as a horror film would be making sure that the actual scary thing actually has some sort of value to it. So, like, the thing that comes to mind for me would be Alien, the first one, because in that movie you have out as a horror film per se, but then once you're somewhat attached to these various different characters, then the horror actually starts. And what's great is that it's not about jump scares every few minutes. It only happens. I don't know, like the fear of what you don't exactly know what's happening or where it is or what exactly it's planning to do makes it very scary.
I have to agree with you very wholeheartedly there. I feel like the best monsters in horror, where they have monsters or aliens or whatever, always represent something like a fear that people actually have in their real lives, like Alien, fear of the unknown, right?
Yeah, that's something that I found was kind of interesting. Is that there's this thing apparently called the Trinity of Fear, Trinity of Terror. That's what it was, which is the protagonist, the I think it was the setting and the monster. And if you look into all the monsters have to be more than just the monsters. Actually, let me take it back. There are three types of monsters. There is the stories where in the end the monster kills or wins. There's the stories where the hero wins or the protagonist, and the stories where the hero is the monster. And it seems to me that the hardest to pull off and the most effective is the one where the hero is the monster. Because, like in Silent Hill, where the hero was the monster, if you can play it up and you can get the audience to start thinking about themselves and putting themselves in the place, then you force the audience to look at an uglier side of themselves represented through the monster. But the problem
Interesting
is,
sort of film idea is because I think a lot of times when you have a character which is supposed to be relatable but in a way that doesn't make them likable, I think that sort of captivates the audience in that way. But you're trying to say something, so go ahead.
No, I wasn't. I don't have much.
You've got all sorts of movies where the main character is like, so it's like it has a sort of satirical element to it, to what exactly we are at times, but then you aren't supposed to like the main character, and they are quote unquote a monster, and not necessarily like an actual thing with claws.
Oh, that sounds kind of cheap, though.
I mean,
because it seems like in the examples I've read about where the monster is the protagonist doesn't realize it until later on. Like, it's not blatantly obvious until they figure it out.
Yeah, it's kind of a very straightforward form of moral relativism, where your moral perspective comes from your standpoint. And I think that there are a lot of people who they have absolutist values, but they're really like relativists in that they believe they're following the law and they believe that they're doing one thing or another and they believe that they're good, but they're really only good by their own standpoints and not by any law or any God's standard.
This is not talking about horror, but it's really interesting. Is that like a lot of times in sort of modern society we tend to deal in personal universals, and I think that that's why we have so much sort of discourse in regards to politics and different philosophical values and things like that.
Colton, are you saying it's all relative?
I'm saying that people think it's relative. No, I'm not saying it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Back to horror.
Back to horror.
We're studying for our philosophy midterm, so.
The most useful thing to do whenever you're studying for philosophy is just like explain it to somebody else. I'm like, oh, it makes so much sense now.
Yeah. Honestly, that's the best way to learn something is to teach somebody else. Anyways, continuing.
Hey, don't worry about going off on a rabbit hole or rabbit trail as long as it's interesting.
I think that'd be really funny if the episode title for this is just like horror movies and political philosophy and.
No man, you gotta get the good clickbait. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah.
You have to have like
all those
Song
politics nerds.
Yeah.
No man, nobody's gonna click on that. You have to have like extreme Donald Trump proven false by
Or the Gone Wrong. See that
gone
one?
wrong, gone sexual, gone wrong and sexual, gone funny, extreme.
All right.
Colton's done.
There's so many clickbait titles.
Just add all of the clickbait titles. I almost died.
And then some boobs. And then we're good. I've got a question.
All right, so
Go on, Colton.
Okay, so my question is, what exactly builds a good horror atmosphere?
Well, that's what my question is. You're just restating it.
Oh, yeah, but
Mm.
I'm kind of bringing it back because I think that's a good question to ask.
All right, Michael. Do you have an answer for that?
He says in the chat that he'll be back in 3 minutes, and it's been like 3 minutes. But yeah, so he'll be back any minute.
Oh shit.
Anyways,
Okay.
but
Should we pause?
so I guess I'll answer for him. But basically,
You already talked.
I'm
Go
not.
on. Go on.
Shut up,
Answer for
Xander.
him.
I'm answering in Michael's perspective.
All right. That's
So, you have a bunch of different, like he was saying earlier, you have a bunch of different kinds of horror movies. So, like with slasher movies, you're gonna want some isolated, element, right, where you're by yourself. And the same thing with space movies too, is that you gotta have this element
horror movie though.
of isolation. No, not always, not always. Sometimes it's the group that's the horror. Like high school.
I think, what am I talking about?
Anyways, so you have this element of isolation in like horror and space movies, and then in not in horror and space, in slasher and space movies, and in slasher movies, you aren't completely isolated though. Like the whole point of slasher movies is that you're trying to get back to civilization. You're trying to get away from isolation, right? In space, you can't do that. You're screwed.
So you're saying that in space, no one can hear you scream?
Shut up. Yes,
No,
that's
there's
what I
nowhere to
said.
run. He didn't say anything about screaming.
Anyways, so I mean, if you have like a buddy, they can probably hear you scream. Or if you have like contact to NASA here in Houston.
You,
Or that thing where if you have two objects touching each other, then the sound waves can travel through the objects, and so technically you can.
Mm-hmm.
Colton,
Touch
let's
pinkies.
touch right now.
Are you guys in the same room?
No. What?
Oh yeah, we still need to do that live episode.
We gotta
I don't know
stop screaming.
how,
He's gonna find out.
but we need to figure out a way to do a live episode. Not that anybody cares.
We care.
Would care.
That's all that matters. All right. So
Anyways, so you have this level of isolation, but the isolation is different in each one, right? And then you have like psychological horror movies, or even It, right, where you're not isolated at all in It. None of the characters are isolated. They live in community with people, although all their parents suck, and like the kid.
Tell us how it really is.
The kid whose mom is like, "You're making me take a wait, what's it called?" No, not that. No, not that. 1 second.
What? You talking about It?
Hey, he's here.
Yeah.
Okay, now you answer, Michael, because I've been trying to answer for you.
About It?
No, what exactly makes a good horror atmosphere?
Oh,
It's a gazebo. It's bullshit.
it's a gazebo.
Yeah, that's a
Damn,
quote
I
from
winked
the
at the
movie.
monitor again. I gotta stop doing that.
I mean, I think it has. Well, it depends on a lot of stuff.
Give me one of them.
I'd say that like I think it was Colton who said there has to be some sort of factor of reality. Is that what you said, right? It has to be some, in a sense, possible, right?
I said that in some way, but you were mainly talking about that.
Not always though, because like look at Soma. Soma's like freaking scary. I mean, it presents this idea of the future, but it can't really happen, especially with AI, because literally, in no matter which way you look at it, with current technology, I'm not talking about having faster computers and better AI. There's no way to have sentient AI, even if the computer creates its own code. Even if it builds its own code, it's still not sentient. Computers run on ones and zeros. They can't create their own thought. So unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, Blade Runner could never exist.
Oh, tell us how it really is, man. No, but I think what's important and why it matters that it's based on some level of realism is that the audience has to be able to relate to what the characters are going through, and the best way to do that is to have them. I don't know, with some horror movies, like, oh yeah, we're up on a space station, and this is something that's happened. Oh, it's just some high school party or whatever.
Right, or take like something like Jaws, like that feeds off a really common feel, and I think who directed that again? It was like
Steven Spielberg.
That's right. So I think he got it right because he got something that a lot of people feel, and he used that as it's such a common thing, but it turns
Fun
out.
fact. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, a lot of people, are afraid of that.
They have that.
Fun fact: Steven Spielberg actually thought that Jaws was the movie that would end his career as a director. Because he overspent on it. The studio was really mad at him, and he was like, "Oh, this is gonna be a crap movie, isn't it?"
That whenever
they redid a bunch of it.
Critics went in there and they sunk their teeth into it. Who's worried about that?
Yep, sunk their teeth. I see what you did there.
I got a question.
You got me.
Have you guys ever read or played or experienced a horror story that actually physically scared you?
Oh yeah.
I mean,
I remember when I first heard about Jeff the Killer. It took me like weeks to get over. I would always look out my window at night.
There was
That's how I was like for Slenderman, which was all your fault, by the way. But go on, Colton.
There's a subreddit called No Sleep. I'm sure you've heard of it. It says horror short stories, and sometimes when I'm feeling particularly
angsty,
wanting to punish myself, then I'll go in there and I'll read a few of those stories, right? And there were about this guy who is pretending to be a park ranger. It was just a series of like documents or whatever, but all of the sort of weird and freaky things that he talks about being out in the woods, like that one kept me up the night after I read it. Because what was one? There's a story about a girl who she was found like screaming in the woods, and the rangers like gave her a blanket and they were walking back to the cabin, and she kept looking behind them and screaming that this like 7-foot tall man was following them. And
was he in a suit?
No. Oh. And then
denied.
Basically, they got split up, and then they never found the girl again. Actually, no, they did, but she was in the middle of a field. She didn't have any socks on or shoes on, and she was bleeding from the eyes. And then he was like, "All right, well, that's that." And
sorry.
No, Michael.
That sort of thing. Like, what the heck is with the mystery about what was that story anyway?
Probably just crazy.
Yeah, I was gonna say the mystery, the unknown factor is another component. Like something like The Exorcist, right? That was one of the big horror movies, and one of the first ones that became so prominent was because it dipped into like this realm of people don't really know whether it is. It's not common fact that this, the spirits are real. but a lot of people tend to think they are, and so whether or not it is, it gives this kind of like you don't know whether it's going to happen, and that causes a bunch of anxiety, which in turn creates a good horror movie.
You know, one game that kept me up at night, and I never played this in person, but I watched a playthrough of it, was The Witch's House. And that's basically a game where you go into this house, and I can't remember the story exactly. There's some big plot twist that I didn't get at the time. But basically, you walk into this house, and you're like this little girl. And towards the end, there's this other little girl with like her eyes are scooped out, and that girl is like you, but you're her, but she's in your body, and she's possessing you, but you didn't know it. And anyways, when I actually remembered the story, it scared the hell out of me.
I think though those are the most interesting horror stories. I think are the ones that really stick with you after you like exit whatever that form of media was.
That's what's cool
And I
about
think
psychological horror, is it's able to do that because it's about you and not somebody else.
yeah, like and that's one thing. I wouldn't say that a movie is bad or bad in any capacity if you don't have that lasting effect. Like something like Alien. Like I was keep bringing this back up. You're not going to be worried about like the giant 8 foot tall xenomorph crawling through the walls. No, but it's still while you're actively involved in that form of media and actively engaged, it's still a very interesting and captivating experience.
You know, damn, what was I gonna say? I had something I wanted to build off of Michael. Oh, right, the unknown. Yeah, so that's kind of the thing about action survival horror games, right? Is that they have a part of their game is action, but unlike the action genre, it's about disempowerment. But a lot of those games, they're scary because of the unknown, because you don't know what's going to happen when you turn around the corner, and you don't know if you have enough ammo to actually fend off, because you know you're not nearly as powerful as whatever's out there in the game. Which, on a side note, Dark Souls also kind of does, which is kind of why it's scary. But I'm not going to talk about that because I bring that up every episode. So, but that's also the problem.
Metal Gear scary.
Shut
Barbie
up!
Dreamhouse is
Shut
scary.
up!
Batman Arkham Knight is scary.
Barbie Dreamhouse! Scary.
It's scary.
Okay, we've mentioned our quota of games for this episode. Continue.
All right, where was it? So that's also the problem with survival horror games, is that after you know the unknown, once you understand the horror, it's no longer scary. And I think that's why survival horror sequels tend to lean more towards action than horror. Like, look at Dead Space. The first Dead Space game is a true survival horror game. The second one is slightly more action, and the third one is just an action game because there's nothing scary about it anymore. And also because they were poorly designed, they didn't really improve on the original. But same difference, that they ended up leaning towards action because there was no more unknown. There was nothing left to explore.
Yes, kind of the same thing happens in Resident Evil 7 towards the end when you've like killed a billion of these black thingies, and you're like, oh, well, it's a bigger black thingy. Guess I'll just kill it harder. You know, like even after all the Baker family and whatever comes through, I mean, you have this big boss fight at the end and everything, but it's not really scary. Like the first half of the game is pretty scary, pretty bad. You know,
Pretty
like
spooky.
the rest of it, eh.
Right, you kind of need that disempowerment to make the player feel like, to make the player scared of his own life. Because when you attach any important idea with the fear for life, that's when horror really shines, because you're able to explore an idea when it's pushed to its utmost. And talking about disempowerment, if I can bring up if I can bring up Dead Space again, there's a section in the game where this regenerating xenomorph is chasing you through the ship, and you can throw as many bullets at it as you want, but it will just keep getting up. But that actually really scared me because I knew that this guy, if I turned around, this guy would kill me, and I don't have enough. It's just an impossibly hard foe that was so incomprehensibly powerful that I could do nothing to it. And so, as you're running through the ship and you're fighting other xenomorphs and you're trying to complete your objective, you have to worry about this massive looming zombie chasing you the whole time. And that was what really scared me in the game.
Same thing happens in Resident Evil 4. It does that really well, where it has this regenerator, and it regenerates, and you can't kill it.
Apparently, that's actually where the Dead
Space
one, the Dead Space 1 took inspiration from Resident Evil 4 a lot, and especially on that regenerating enemy. So,
yeah, I think another thing is loss of hope. Well, the idea of hope and the just the fact that there is hope is something well, I guess I'm trying to say. So take like something like I love like zombie horror movies, right? I have a thing for them. Ever since The Walking Dead came out, I don't really like it anymore. But the thing about that was that the whole planet was infected with this terrible disease, and if there was just, let's say, just a couple 100,000 people were just infected with this disease, it wouldn't be that scary because then the military would just take care of it, and it's just another disease. But the thing about the zombie genre, is that everyone's dead, and everyone's against you, and the hope is so small it diminishes, and that makes everything much more fragile. And that's for like in Alien, and there's like when the people went to the planet, there was only like what, maybe 10, 12 people, and as each person dies, it counts down to basically what the audience feels like. Once all of them are dead, the audience is just like, oh no, that's the worst thing that can happen. So yeah,
it also speaks to the idea of isolation a little bit, where people are social creatures by nature. Everybody wants to be together, right? It makes us feel safer, and we believe that allows us to do anything.
Even introverts need friends, yeah.
It's true.
Especially in, I think introverts and extroverts kind of goes out the window when you're dealing in a life-death situation.
Yeah, I think, of course, like you mean when it comes down to it?
When it comes down to it.
Yeah, definitely.
But I also think that the human creatures, the humans are social creatures, an interesting statement. Because there are forms of horror that happen whenever they start attacking that sense of camaraderie. And so whenever you have a character, like, of your story, which gives the characters some reason to distrust each other or feel that they're in danger when they're together, then right there you're already putting the audience in more of a state where they can't really trust anyone. The plot, I can't think of a movie specifically does this, but it's like, oh, it's a parasite, and the parasite takes over things and then kills them. Or it kills it's like very violent and kills things. And eventually, you just can't trust any of the other characters because at any point they could turn into the monster.
That's what always scared me about zombie movies when I was younger, or just zombies in general, was that being consumed by a primitive force and losing my identity and turning on somebody else, or somebody else turning on me. Like, I played a lot of Left 4 Dead with my one buddy back in the day, and that game was the scariest thing because the world, like Michael said, isolated us, and at any point, you basically had no hope left, and your only hope was to get to the end, and we always played on hard difficulty, so that hope wasn't really there. But that was really scary. Because
I also think that may speak to this our sort of society's tendency to fear death so much, is that we're afraid of losing who we are.
true.
I think it kind of goes beyond just, well, I don't want it to be over. I think it matters more to us that I don't want to lose myself. And I don't want to lose. You guys get what I'm saying here?
You said it. You don't want to
Yeah,
lose who you are, your
somewhat.
identity, what you've worked for.
I feel like death is more of an unknown feeling because I feel like humans are very scared of the unknown. I feel like that's kind of the main thing, but I understand where you're coming from. Yeah.
Assume like we like not talking about, because the question of what happens after death is really one of the big religious questions, and if we go through from a secular way to look at it, and which is generally closer to atheism or nihilism, then just the end of what we are. And at
the end of like all happy things and stuff.
All happy things, it's the end of our personalities and our spirit. And I think that's what's scary about it.
Well, now we're just talking about the fear of death, but that is why horror is so interesting, because it can use the fear of death to make you look at something that you would otherwise want to just hide.
But that's a good question right there. Has horror ever gone past the fear of death, or is every horror medium, is it only dealt in death, or is there something else that our desire to keep it manipulates? If that makes any sense.
I don't know. I don't understand the genre enough. Haven't experienced it enough.
So you're saying has there ever been a horror movie in which death was not the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah. No, like in every, it's not necessarily physical threats to us, but it's something else.
Like psychological terror?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at spiritual things like The Conjuring is a horror movie that has to do with spirits and stuff, which possess. Well, I mean, I guess death. Well,
What about movies about undeath where you can't die?
What, like?
There's my answer. There's an answer. The Doctor Who episode with the Weeping Angels.
Go on. After you finish, we'll probably
I think so. I think so. Yeah. Where it's like the guy who, if you look at them, you freeze or something.
No, if you look them in the eyes for too long, you freeze.
Yeah.
If they move around as long as you aren't looking at them, and if they manage to touch you, you don't die, but you teleport back in time. I think it's like 80 years, and that basically means that your world that you live in now is gone, and you're forced to live an entirely separate reality. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what it's doing, is that instead of killing you, it's fear of being stripped away of everything that you have and all the people that you love and being thrown back into the reality.
My question is, why didn't the Doctor just go back and pick them up 80 years ago?
I don't remember. It's been a long time since I watched that show.
Is it because they couldn't find her, or is it because once you see their gravestone or something, they're infinitely dead?
Infinitely dead.
I can Google it, but that's a separate project for later.
All right, then. On that happy note, you guys have any last thoughts, or shall we wrap up here? That's not a thought.
It's scary.
Scary as hell.
Yep.
And
spooky.
All right. Spooky. That's going to be edited.
You should use that more often.
Oh no, is that a negative 500?
That was over 0. Yeah.
That was over 0. Wait 1 second. How loud is this?
Yep. All right, ladies and gentlemen.
I'd like to point out that in this episode, we talked about horror movies, the universalism of society, the fear of death, and then back to horror movies.
And just horrifying people. I was known as Xander.
And horrifying noises.
Yes.
All right. See you, Internet.
Goodbye.